Okay, so if anyone has any questions, okay, perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Samantha.
Yeah, of course. Um, so we also know that while military sexual trauma is happening at what could be described as really epidemic levels, um, it's not an issue that is getting proper attention, both within the military and upon returning home when we're talking about veterans. We know that within the military in 2020, in cases where the military could have taken action following an experience of sexual assault, meaning the military knew that the assault had been reported and a report had been filed, an official report had been filed by the victim. Only 4% of cases actually went to prosecution. So only 4% of cases went to trial, and less than 1% of offenders were actually convicted of their assault. And so as a result, this is feeding into a environment where survivors often don't report what happened to them. And so they keep it to themselves, or maybe they tell just a friend, and that will complicate their symptoms that they may be experiencing upon coming home and running into you as you're providing them a service. So as a result, roughly 3 out of 4 victims did not report the crime in fiscal year 2018. In 2018, the number of women who were assaulted in the military was roughly 13,000. So again, this is happening to a ridiculously high number of people. We also know that it has bearings on the experiences of survivors after leaving the military. Veterans with an MST history are twice as likely to experience homelessness upon returning home from the military. And so we see that this is going to result in a high level of people who may be in need of various services once they come home because they're having sort of a fallout of support. We also know that in 2017, over 1.3 million outpatient visits occurred at VA for MST related care. So this is resulting in really high need for mental health services, for support, for other kinds of assistance the VA can provide. This is not something that happens in the service and then doesn't impact you long after.
Samantha, can I just cut in and let you know that the audience is not seeing the slides advance? We're still on the first slide. But
Oh,
I think
weird.
yeah, so I don't know if you're scrolling down, but
Okay, that is good to know. The let me see. Oh, what about now?
oh yeah, okay. So we're on MST myths now.
Yes. Okay,
Okay, perfect.
great. Oh, oh, sorry. Hold on. Give me a second. Technical problems. All right. Are we seeing MST myths or are we back to not only seeing the first?
We can see MST myths. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So, yes. So I wanted to address some common MST myths that are held by advocates and veterans that can disrupt the process in terms of making someone comfortable, making them know that they can be supported, making them know that they have options available to them for help. One of the first myths is just, again, who is an MST survivor? It's really common that people have preconceived notions of who may be a survivor of military sexual trauma in the same way that oftentimes you will see civilians have preconceived notions of who might be a veteran in front of them, right? We see the same thing when it comes to MST survivors. So it's important to remember that survivors come in all shapes and sizes. They are all genders. They are all ages. They are all sexual orientations. They may present as someone who seems very freshly traumatized, for lack of a better expression there, or it could be someone who really has, been engaging in therapy, has made a lot of progress and seems as if they're doing fine, but maybe they still have this really traumatic history in their past. I've had survivors come forward who have never told anyone what happened to them, and they're now in their 70s, in their 80s. I've had survivors talking about what happened to them, and it happened just a few months ago when they were discharged, right before they were discharged from the military. So again, just because someone's presenting a certain way in front of you, you never want to rule out the possibility that this is an experience they may have had. Frequently among advocates, we see a preconceived notion of some more detailed aspects of survivors. We'll see a lot of advocates who think that all survivors are going to have post-traumatic stress disorder. That's sort of the main takeaway that a lot of advocates have, especially civilian advocates. And while many survivors certainly do have PTSD, many do not. Many have other diagnoses. Many have no diagnosis at all, right? So it's important to remember that not all MST wounds are mental. There are people who were physically injured in the context of experiencing military sexual trauma. It's important to know that not all survivors are going to be engaging in treatment. Not all of them are open to the idea of engaging in treatment at the point in time at which you meet with them. Not all survivors remember every detail of what happened to them. And just because someone says they experienced military sexual trauma, again, we talked about this at the beginning, doesn't mean that they experienced rape. It doesn't mean that they necessarily experienced sexual assault. They may have experienced pervasive sexual harassment. And so keep bearing in mind all of the uniqueness of the experience is important. We also know that when it comes especially to VA benefits, there are a lot of myths that are believed by veteran survivors with regards to their entire feelings about approaching the system. And I know that some of you work in areas where VA benefits are really relevant, some of you may not, but it's important to talk about because it can blend into eligibility for other things, and it just blends into this whole sense that some survivors may have about their experience. Some of these myths are based on just word of mouth spreading in really bad ways amongst the veteran community about how some policy or system works. Some of these are based on the fact that policies around MST have improved over time. They're nowhere near where they need to be, in my opinion, but they're much better than they used to be. And so sometimes survivors applied for things in the past, and then the rules changed. They don't know the rules changed. And so they assume that the rules are still the way they were when they applied, 10, 20 years ago. So for example, this notion that if you didn't report sexual assault, you can't file a claim for benefits with the VA. You absolutely can and should. But it used to be that if you didn't have a report filed, your claim was going to get denied. If I didn't get treatment in the military, I can't file for benefits. Yes, you can. If I didn't get treatment for years, I can't file a claim for benefits. Yes, you can. If I don't have PTSD or I don't take medications, if I wasn't raped, all of these things are not bars to obtaining VA benefits. And as a result, they are not bars to being considered a survivor of MST. And that's why I think these are so important, even for those folks of you who work outside the benefit space, to understand that this all feeds into like, do I count as a survivor? Was my experience valid? How is someone going to see my experiences? A lot of times, all of these myths around the VA system blend into survivors' perceptions of their own experiences outside of VA world as well. And so it's important to just remind survivors that every experience of military sexual trauma is valid. Every experience is worth paying attention to. And each survivor story is important, regardless of any of these outside factors. So one of the things that I talk a lot about in my work, both now as a professor with my students, but also when I was creating my new legal program, was trauma-informed interviewing. How to work in a way so that we are not overly traumatizing our client population where possible. So what is trauma? a trauma is an emotional response to a horrific event. It can be an accident, it could be rape, it could be a natural disaster, and it doesn't have boundaries with regard to age, gender, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. Everyone can experience trauma, and everyone can have lasting impact of that trauma on their lives. So when we think about the types of things that cause trauma, there are sort of obvious examples, like things like exposure to violence, physical or sexual abuse, natural disasters. These are things where we can very easily wrap our heads around the notion that, like, yes, that could absolutely cause trauma to a person who experienced those things. But there are also less obvious examples in the ways of discrimination, poverty, systemic failures. These are things that can also cause trauma to individuals. And what's important here to remember is that, similar to when I was saying that sometimes MST survivors have had more than one experience, sometimes MST survivors come from a prior to the military, may have had traumatic experiences in their life. And so the MST is not their first experience of trauma. It's a compounding factor of other traumatic experiences. With my clients, most of them are living well below the poverty line. And so I'm meeting them at a time at which they are going through an actively traumatic experience of living in poverty, being afraid of not being able to pay the bills, being afraid of not being able to put food on the table. That's traumatic in and of itself. And then on top of that, they've had these experiences of sexual abuse in the military. And so thinking about how that compounds the issue and how, as a result, I'm dealing with someone who has experienced multiple forms of trauma, and bearing that in mind when I'm working with them. Common reactions to trauma include re-experiencing the trauma in the form of nightmares or flashbacks, in the form of changes in emotion, whether that be sadness, anger. It can really span the gamut. Some clients are totally just numb. Avoidance, changed view of the world, whether that be not trusting others, whether that be being super self-critical and feeling like they somehow played a role in what happened to them, whether it's being very fearful of other people, hyperarousal. This is something that we see a lot of, this sense of like feeling on guard, being jumpy, quick to respond to things, quick to react, quick to anger, quick to escalate, that feeling of going from like 0 to 100 on the emotional scale really quickly. And this image here on the left of the slide, I always like to show, because I think that a lot of times people feel that like, oh, if I am responding to my traumatic experience, it's because like I haven't come far enough in my treatment, or there's something wrong with me. Why can't I get past this? Why can't I improve? And what's important to note is that trauma has an actual impact on the makeup of our brain. It actually changes how our brain responds to certain stimuli and certain situations. And so this slide shows on the left that of a healthy brain, quote unquote, and on the right, an abused brain. In this case, this was a child. This was someone who'd experienced child abuse. And you can see on the left, like the brain has a lot more colors going on. There's a lot less of those black spots in the image. And that's because the brain is like functioning in all the ways it's supposed to. It's responding to lots of different things going on, and it's able to have a lot of different systems working at the same time. If you picture like a job site, it's got like a ton of people doing all these different jobs. In an abused brain, you have a lot more of those dark spaces where things aren't happening, where there's less activity going on. You see the purple colors, the black colors, and the green colors really dominating, which are the least active parts of the brain. And so you can see that there's been actual biological change to this individual as a result of the trauma they went through. And it's important to bear that in mind, especially at times when you may feel like, why is this client not doing what I need them to do? Why are they not cooperating? There's been an actual biological change to what's going on, and they can't necessarily just be like, oh, okay, I'll be more cooperative now. And having that understanding and that empathy and that patience can be really helpful when approaching client work. Typically, all of these types of symptoms will reduce over time in an individual, right? So for example, you get in a really bad car accident, and the next time you get in your car and you're driving, especially if you're driving in like the same area, you feel a little bit shaky, you're a little bit nervous. Maybe if you get hit by a particular type of car, you see that car coming and you like feel that rush of adrenaline. But then the next time you're driving a car, it gets a little bit easier and a little bit easier. And over time, you start just driving as if like nothing happened to you again. That's how trauma works in typical situations. However, if symptoms don't resolve over about a month, that's when we start wondering whether the person's developing PTSD. It's that longer form version of the traumatic response. As I mentioned, trauma impacts the brain in a lot of ways. It changes one's ability to process or regulate emotions. It changes our ability to problem size, to empathize, to understand the consequences of our actions, to experience typical memory function. And regardless of the field you work in, you probably can think of ways in which each and every one of these different skill sets impacts someone's ability to do what you may need them to do. Right? If you have a client who can't experience typical memory function and you need to get a detailed retelling of something that happened to them last week, they might struggle to do that for you. Problem solve. There are times where I'm like so shocked by a client not being able to like address a really small thing that's going on. And it's like, well, maybe they've experienced trauma and they're having problems being able to analyze the situation in a cohesive way. Understanding the consequences of our actions can be really difficult, and regulating emotions, right? Having a client who is having trouble regulating their emotions can be really difficult to work with. It's important to remember that when dealing with especially sexual assault, we often in society talk about a fight or flight response that people will have. And so either they're running away from the trauma or they're fighting against their attacker. But in reality, psychologists have started to understand that there's actually a broader typical response to sexual assault happening. And so it's not just fight or flight, it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And so freeze is the idea that something's happening to you and your entire body just stops. It shuts down. It doesn't have the ability to properly respond to what's going on. And this is when you see, people saying to survivors like, well, why didn't you fight back? One of the actual biological responses to a sexual assault happening, to a traumatic incident happening, may be to just freeze in panic. And that's completely normal. With fawn, this is where we see almost like a bargaining type nature, a sense of, I'll do whatever I need to do to make it out of this situation. I often will give my students the example of, you hear a lot of times, if someone comes up to you and they're trying to mug you, you hand them your wallet and hope that they'll then go away and not cause you any bodily harm. It's the same sort of thing of just if I just get through this moment, I'll survive. It's a survival tactic that our bodies go through. And so again, this can lead to really complicated feelings among survivors if they feel like, well, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I do something? Why didn't I run away? Well, your body was responding in a completely normal and understandable way that we just don't talk about as much. So what types of behaviors or reactions might we see in survivors of military sexual trauma, especially if your work involves talking about their experience with them, which a lot of folks' work will require those kinds of conversations. We may see an increase in active symptomology when we're working with our clients. And what I mean by that is if you are causing your client to need to talk about what happened to them repeatedly, or even just once, but in a lot of detail, which, for example, as a lawyer, my work does, right? I need to hear what happened to them. I need to know about it in detail. I need to figure out what they're eligible for and things like that. And so oftentimes during that time period in my relationship with my clients, their symptoms will get worse. They will get heightened because they're going back to where they were. They're not able to, most of us don't walk around talking about the worst thing that ever happened to us on a daily basis. And so it can increase the level of symptoms as we're dealing with the issue. On the flip side, you might have a client who has a really flattened affect, who feels really disconnected, who doesn't seem motivated, who doesn't seem engaged in the process of whatever it is they're trying to get. It seems as if they don't care. It doesn't necessarily mean they don't care. It might just be there's a numbness, there's a flattened affect to what's going on. Avoidance, especially if your work does require confronting the experiences that the client has had. They may avoid working with you. They may avoid returning your calls. They may avoid dealing with the situation. Even if your work doesn't involve talking about the incident that happened to them, you may find that they are almost associating, any stressful situation is going to bring them back there. And so they may avoid dealing with situations. We talked about forgetfulness, distrust, not feeling as if they can confide in you or trust you, and having difficulty focusing on tasks, all of which, of course, can be really difficult. Complex trauma is when we have situations where individuals were experiencing trauma over a long period of time. So perhaps this wasn't a one-time incident in the military. Perhaps this was something that was happening repeatedly to them. Perhaps it was one incident of sexual assault, but then they were constantly being forced to work alongside their abuser. We see this a lot in the military because of the nature of the fact that you work together, you live together, etc. And so you can see that level of complex trauma, which is basically, if you picture all of the symptoms we've been talking about, but amped up times a bunch, that's complex trauma. Many of you are probably familiar with PTSD, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what PTSD is, but it's basically, as we mentioned earlier, this idea that the symptoms don't just go away after a short period of time. The symptoms last, and that changed worldview is really happening. We know that 1 in 11 people, that's veteran or not, are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder during their lifetime. And we know that there are higher rates of occurrence of post-traumatic stress disorder in women than in men. We do see really high rates of PTSD among veterans, obviously, and then in particular among military sexual trauma survivors. You'll notice these are very similar symptoms that we've been discussing when it comes to the common signs of post-traumatic stress disorder that we often see amongst clients. So when working with clients, it's important to bear in mind this idea of triggers. We hear about this word a lot, it's thrown around a lot, but what is it? It's a psychological stimulus that prompts an involuntary recall of a previous traumatic incident. So it's something that happens that snaps you right back to where you were when something traumatic happened to you. So I often say, think about the 5 senses. These are the types of things that are likely to be triggers. There may be sounds. So for example, I had a client who, when her sexual assault happened, there was particular music playing in the room that she was in. And now anytime she hears music of even that genre, she is triggered by it. She immediately, her brain goes back to the incident of sexual assault. Smells, if the perpetrator of the assault was a smoker of cigarettes, for example, cigarette smoke could become a trigger for that person. One of my clients talks about the fact that it was raining on the day in which she experienced sexual assault, and every time it rained, she's sort of brought back to that place. So really anything can end up being a trigger, and this can be really difficult when you are trying to not traumatize the person you're working with, to bear in mind these triggers. So what can we do to anticipate for or avoid triggers in our work with our clients? The first thing is communication. Finding out from your clients what their triggers are, what are things that might set them off, can be really helpful. And oftentimes it feels uncomfortable to address these issues, but in reality, they lead to a much stronger relationship between you and your clients when they know that you are trying really hard to avoid those things. So for example, my client with the rain, anytime I have a meeting scheduled with her and I check the weather and I realize it's going to rain, I say, you know what, let's schedule it for another day. We don't need to meet today. Today's going to be a bad day. I know that. That's okay. So offering options to your clients in terms of things that you can avoid. If they let you know that like a certain music is problematic, don't meet them in a place that's going to have that music going on. If your client has expressed that a particular scent is triggering to them, try to avoid meeting with them in places where that's going to happen. Providing explanations of why you need to discuss with them the things that you need to discuss so that they understand the why behind it. Planning for what to do if support is needed can be really helpful. So having a game plan, safety planning essentially with your clients to make sure that they know that there are options, that you are invested in ensuring they stay safe during the course of your work with them will go a really long way. Offering breaks in the conversation can be very helpful for some. For others, it's the opposite. I have some clients who are like, I would much rather get through one really difficult conversation with you than have like 20 different small conversations where we're getting just pieces of the story. Okay, I can work that way. Being considerate with note taking. For some clients, taking notes will read as you're not that interested, right? If you're just sitting there on your computer and you are typing away and you're not making eye contact with them, that can feel like someone who doesn't care. So thinking about having conversations with clients, obviously we often all need to take notes in our work, but finding ways to do so or explaining to the client that you will be doing it in advance and that it's not that you're not listening to them. For you, if anything, it's helpful because it makes sure that you remember the most important things. But triggers might happen in the course of working with a client, and that's to some degree expected and likely to happen. And so being understanding, validating their feelings when they are experiencing some sort of trigger, asking what would help. So I will often, if I notice a client is getting visibly distressed, would you like a glass of water? If they came with a friend and I told the friend they need to wait in the waiting room, because with lawyers, we deal with issues of confidentiality, right? So I may have sent the friend to the waiting room, but saying, would you like me to go get the friend and bring her in for a minute so that you can like have a moment? Grounding can be really helpful. These are ways of helping to remind the client that while they are experiencing potentially some sort of flashback, some sort of their mind going back to the place of what happened to them, reminding them that they're not there, they're here in the moment with you. And it can be as simple as just bringing them to something tangible in the room, reminding them that they're here, they're not back where they were when this assault happened to them. So something as simple as noting the shoes they're wearing or talking about a painting on the wall in your office can help bring them to the reminder of, okay, I'm not back there, I'm here, I'm in this place. Being trauma informed is all about the approach you're taking with your client population. It's all about the framing of the work you're doing. Instead of wondering what's wrong with this person, why are they being this way, it's what happened to them. It's what informed their experiencing. Understanding that self-destructive behaviors may be coping mechanisms or attempts to develop coping mechanisms rather than character flaws. Your client is probably not trying to be a difficult client. It may be things they need to do in order to get from one day to the next. It requires patience, transparency. It requires giving your client a sense of predictability. One thing that most survivors share across the board is a sense of a loss of control, a loss of autonomy, a loss of feeling like they have any power over what happened to them. And so any situation in which you can instill a sense of autonomy, predictability, power and control back to your client is a gift. It is something that you can do that will always benefit the relationship. And so explaining to them how things will unfold, how you're going to be working with them are all things you can do that help establish a stronger relationship. I know that not all, if any of you are necessarily lawyers on the call, but when it comes to trauma-informed lawyering, what we are often trying to do is we are trying to improve legal advocacy by recognizing the role that trauma plays in the lawyer-client relationship. So even if you're not a lawyer, this is about recognizing the role that trauma plays in your client relationship, in your relationship with the person that you are trying to help. However, it's also important to note that this at no point means becoming a therapist for your client population. I always say it's important to identify all the different roles that people are playing in this client's life. And medical professionals are one really important role. Therapists are a really important role. So just because you are bearing all of these things in mind, just because you are paying attention to trauma, because you are trying to help, does not mean that you are becoming your client's therapist. And setting those boundaries is really key. So if you are trying to navigate the peer-to-veteran relationship or other provider-to-veteran relationship and building rapport, it's really helpful to acknowledge how the client is feeling. Ask what you can do to mitigate re-traumatization. We talked about this idea that you can, asking questions is helpful. It doesn't show that you don't know what you're doing. It doesn't show anything other than that you are trying to provide a safe and supportive environment. Setting limits on what you can do and what you can't do and being upfront about that, being very transparent about the purpose of the relationship that you're building with them. If it's a peer support, if it's providing resources to housing to prevent homelessness, if it is being a lawyer, whatever it is, explaining what the goals are and how you're going to go about them, setting expectations of each meeting. So again, you're giving back that sense of power and control to the person you're helping so that they go into the meeting feeling like, I know what's going to happen today. And not, I'm going into this meeting having no clue what on earth is about to happen to me. If you are working in a field in which you are going to have to talk about difficult things, where you're going to have to delve into the trauma experiences, I will often end up in situations where clients are avoiding my calls because they know that when I call, we have to talk about difficult things. And sometimes they're having a day where like it would not be productive or helpful for them to talk about what happened to them. And so I will always say to my clients, we all have bad days. We have days that are not days we want to deal with this issue. If I call you on a day that is a bad day, rather than just blow off my call, answer the phone and just say, it's a bad day, or just say, not today, and hang up. Because it lets me know that you're still invested in this, you're still involved, you're still paying attention to what's going on. I'm not going to ask you to elaborate. I will accept that you have said that, but it lets me know that you're still in this fight, you're still in this game. Don't give survivors a list of a million things to do. It can be really hard when your brain is operating at 1,000,000 miles an hour to remember to do 20 different things. Take things step by step. Because it will lead to much better response rate. You will get the documents you need. You will get the things you need at a much higher rate. Putting things in writing. So even if you have a phone call or an in-person conversation with this person, write everything down afterwards and give that to them so that if their brain is sort of working on overdrive, they have it back at home so that they can process it later and make sure they're staying on top of what it is that you need from them. It's also important to note the ways in which working with trauma survivors is going to have an impact on you. And this can often be really difficult to grasp, to understand. And a quote that I was given when I first started doing this work that has stuck with me ever since is, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. If you are working with traumatized populations, you will feel the weight of that trauma at various points in your work, and that is normal and that is okay. And it doesn't mean you're not cut out for this work. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do this work. It just means you're human. You may find that you are viewing the world differently, perhaps a bit more cynically, perhaps more pessimistically. You may notice that you are experiencing compassion fatigue, where it is just really hard to continue to care so much when you are so overwhelmed by the weight of other people's suffering. You may also find that you are experiencing heightened levels of compassion, that maybe you are really satisfied in your job because you know you're helping people. So the impact of working with survivors can really span the gamut in terms of positive and negative responses. But a negative response can include vicarious trauma, which can be a big challenge for people working in fields of victim services, any other allied professionals, because you're constantly being exposed to victims of trauma and violence, which can shake our beliefs of what the world is like and how we think it should be operating. You may find that you are experiencing a shorter fuse. You may be quicker to respond to things. You may find that you are having physical symptoms like fatigue or headaches. You might have difficulty sleeping. You might start questioning, what am I doing? I remember there was a point in my work where I was like, I just feel like all I'm doing all day is putting band-aids on bullet wounds. Like, I'm not able to actually stop this trauma from having happened to my clients. I'm fighting the fight after it already happened. And it felt really dark for a while, which can lead to things like a decreased quality in work or low motivation. At a certain point, it can lead to reduced compassion. If you are just hearing trauma after trauma after trauma, you may respond less and less each time to the severity of the trauma of those you're helping. It could also feel as if you need to try to save the world, right? You need to be working around the clock. You need to not put things down because you're the only one who can help, and overworking yourself. It's important to know that vicarious trauma is not a sign of weakness or an inability to work with trauma survivors. It's a perfectly normal response to the fact that you are dealing with a human who is suffering in front of you, and our instinct is to help. It's important to talk about when you are experiencing these types of symptoms, address the fact that you are experiencing trauma, find your own support methods, whether that's going to therapy, whether it's finding a hobby that you can just dive into, whether it's listening to music that makes you feel good, whether it's setting boundaries of, after work every day, I go to the gym for an hour and I let out all my frustration, whether it's all these things that you do to make yourself feel better. And I am not a believer that there is any such thing as being able to just leave work at work and not think about it anymore. You're gonna think about it. That's okay. But finding ways to be able to be okay and engage in the rest of your life in meaningful ways while still feeling the weight of what's going on and what you're dealing with your clients or your population. We've talked about some of this, and I know I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to power through a little bit here. When it comes to meeting with a client who is a survivor, it can be really helpful, again, to set a structure, to explain to them, our meeting is going to be for X period of time. I need to get X information from you. That is the goal of our meeting today. Makes it a little less overwhelming and scary, especially for individuals who may have never dealt with whatever system you are operating in. Finding out what it is that they're looking for help with and explaining the ways in which you can help and what everyone's role is going to be. What are you going to need from them? What can they expect from you? Finding out who else is in the support system, who else is around who can be helpful, who can make sure the client feels supported. So again, you're not becoming a therapist. Who else can help get documents together, help them find things? Does your client have a social worker or a case manager who might be able to help navigate various things with you so that it's not just you and the client against the world? And setting boundaries. There are limits to what each and every one of us can do within our jobs, to what we're able to help with, being clear about those boundaries and helping to find other resources for our clients so that they can get the help they need, even if it's not possible for them to get that particular thing from you. Each and every one of us are helping our clients in certain ways, and we all facilitate getting them to the place they need to be. It can be helpful to repeat things your clients have said if you're not sure that you're understanding what it is that they're conveying to you, to make sure you're understanding it right, giving them that opportunity to correct and say, no, actually, that's not really what I meant, making sure you really understand things, encouraging elaboration so as to avoid confusion on experiences, making sure you really do understand what it is they're telling you and why they're telling it to you. It can be helpful to change how you ask questions based on the type of information you're trying to get from your client. If you are really trying to information gather from someone and you have no idea what happened to them and you're trying to figure out what's going on, you might want to ask really broad, open-ended questions that allow them to elaborate. But if you need concrete, specific information, asking those directed questions that lead to an exact answer. When did you move to New York? Give me the year, right? Instead of saying like, and then what happened, which could lead to 5 different stories that are going to take you in different directions. Circling back to things. So when you are asking those big open-ended questions, allowing your client to take the answer where they need to take it, while also understanding that like taking notes and saying, I need to circle back to that thing they said earlier so that I can get more information. So you're allowing them to speak, you're not interrupting or cutting them off, but you're also making sure you're walking away with the information you need to at the end of the day. It's important to think about our relationships with the veterans we're serving, just like any other people that we work with, in that we don't need to delve into trauma histories on appointment 1 or meeting 1 or day 1. That's not how people are, right? You'd feel very surprised if you met someone and they were like, so tell me about the worst moment of your life the first time you met them. It would be startling. It would be, and you'd probably not do it and you might not go back. It's possible that someone will want to open up to you right away. And if so, that's wonderful. Probably means you're doing something right in terms of how you're presenting and seeming open. But understand that not all survivors are going to want to talk about what happened to them on the first meeting. Instead, spending that time forming a relationship, getting documents together that you need to get together for whatever work you're doing, making sure you are laying out those roles and responsibilities, making lists of things you're going to need to be doing. These are all things to do that can establish a relationship and a sense of back and forth with the client without delving into the nitty-gritty of their traumatic experiences. When talking about trauma, it's important to get the phrase, I understand, just out of the vocabulary, because the truth is we don't. Even if you yourself are a survivor, your experience is different than their experience. You don't fully understand. You can't go in their shoes in that way. And so it's important to express our support through things like, that must have been incredibly difficult for you, or I can't imagine what that must have been like, because I really can't imagine what that must have been like, rather than saying I understand, which can feel dismissive and insincere, especially if the client knows that, like, no, you don't understand. Asking questions that show that you're trying to learn more rather than that you're trying to dismiss them based on the answer. So for example, I know that if I just said to my client, did you report your sexual assault? They're going to assume that if they say no, I might say, well, then you can't do X, Y, or Z, which is not what I mean by the question at all. I just want to know if they reported. And so saying the majority of survivors don't report their assault. Did you? It's okay if you didn't, but it's just helpful information for me to know if you did, right? Phrasing the question so that it's clear there's not a wrong answer. The more comfortable you are talking about things like sexual assault and trauma, the more comfortable your client will feel talking to you about it. I always give the doctor example. We talk about really personal and intimate things with our doctors. And part of why we feel comfortable doing that is our doctors don't have weird reactions when we tell them things. They treat things like they're normal. They treat these things like they're just commonplace issues for people to have. And doing the same thing where we're not responding of like, oh my God, or oh wow, or giggling or feeling silly or uncomfortable with certain questions or issues can go a long way to making someone feel comfortable. And when possible, providing options for how we talk to our clients and our partners. Some people like in person, some people like phones, some people like email. Certain things will allow you to learn more about the people you're working with by just being open to different experiences and the way things unfold. I have just a couple more slides, but I am aware of the time. And so Melanie, I don't know if there are some questions we want to address to make sure we get those in.
The main question is, are you comfortable sharing with us, sharing these slides with our attendees?
100%. I will send that to you, Melanie, and you can distribute.
If anyone does have questions, feel free to use the hand raising reaction or to type them in the chat.
Okay. All right, so I will keep going. If questions come up, I can flag them. We're almost done though. I just wanted to actually, so yeah, we basically are through. I wanted to provide some resources for support and other things for veterans who are survivors who you're working with, because again, at no point does being trauma informed mean you have to take on the burden of being their sole system of support. And so when it comes to especially medical care, which includes things like therapy, group therapy, individual one-on-one therapy, there are a lot of resources out there. And so again, the slides will be shared so you'll have access to this, but there are the vet centers in both Nassau and Suffolk County, which have individuals who specialize in providing therapy and support to survivors of military sexual trauma. The Northport VA Medical Center, I believe, at least used to have a support group for survivors. I'm not sure whether that's still operating, but I know it is something they've done in the past. And if folks were interested, I would imagine they would be open to restarting. For folks who don't want to interact with the VA system at all, which is fairly common, there's also the Stephen A. Cohen Military Family Center, rather, which is part of the NYU Langone Health System. And there's also the Headstrong Project, both of which are military focused but non-military affiliated programs for folks who are in need of support. And I think that was it. Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say that you did an amazing job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It always feels like a bit of a marathon.
Good work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Catherine, you have a specific question about the context of this. Do you want to ask more about that, or?
I'm trying to figure out how. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, I am a peer-to-peer support person,
Yep.
And also both childhood and military sexual assault survivor. And I'm new at the peer-to-peer thing, and I'm trying to figure out how to help veterans that may need legal aid in these areas. So I'm just looking for the information that you just gave while I was trying to type.
So we will definitely send out the slides if you want. I actually have a resource list. Every county has a vet center which deals with combat veterans and military sexual trauma survivors. In her slide, she did only list Suffolk and Nassau, but every county in New York should have a vet center. And a veteran does not need to have a disability rating to go and use those MST support services.
Nor do they have to have an honorable discharge, which is very important, especially with MST survivors. The vet centers have much more lenient eligibility requirements than the VA hospitals do when it comes to that. In terms of legal support, what I can do is before I send these slides over to Melanie, I can add in a slide after the medical resources. I can add some legal resources, which will of course include my clinic here at Hofstra as well, where you can send folks. We assist with veterans regardless of whether or not they are MST survivors, but we do prioritize MST survivors in terms of making sure they're receiving the proper services they need.
Okay, great. Thank you. It took me 16 years because I didn't know that there were lawyers that would help. So I think that's amazing. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Melanie, Samantha, this is Bob Nevins. Can I make a comment? Okay. I don't want to sound antagonistic here. Okay. I don't want to sound critical. Okay. I need to share something though. I am a Vietnam veteran, combat veteran, flew helicopters in Vietnam, medevac, been there, done all that. When I watched the suicide rates increase over the years and watched the mental health community deal with it, there was no change. Record suicides in the military. So this is my life's work now. So I started a program, a nonprofit, and it just happens to be a horse program. But this is the critical part. I had already successfully worked with over 500 suicidal veterans with like a 95% success rate. But I didn't even know what the hell I was. I didn't even, what's that?
I took your program.
You did at one time? Oh yeah, okay. So what we have found, okay, and I am now aligned with the Polyvagal Institute, Dr. Stephen Porges. You need to make a note of this, okay? But what we have found and what I had accidentally discovered is anytime a normal human being experiences trauma, whether it's war, sexual assault, and of the 800 people that have gone through my program, 30% are military sexual trauma. I don't even inquire what the trauma is. They call me, the first thing I say to them is, "Well, how you sleeping?" I say, "What are you kidding, man? I haven't slept in 35 years. Okay, so we know, and they're not calling me because I'm a recreational program. They're calling me because other vets have said, you got to call this guy. Now, this is what we discovered. Anytime a person experiences trauma, what actually is happening? It's like an emotional circuit breaker pops in their nervous system. And that vagus nerve, which transmits all the information to the brain, and the slide you show about lighting up, when that circuit breaker trips, it takes offline all of these things you're talking about in the slide. And all the talk in the world, this is where I get in trouble, all the talk in the world is not going to reset the circuit breaker. When lightning hits your house and you're sitting around in the dark and people are suggesting all the things you can do, or the VA is giving you a candle to hold up in the dark, and that's what they consider help, that doesn't work. You have to know where the circuit breaker is. Okay,
Thank you.
Stephen Porges has developed this now, but when we do our program, what I call now post-traumatic re-regulation, it's a re-regulation of the autonomic nervous system that tells the brain you're at a danger. If you try to go through the brain, it's shut off and it's not communicating.
Bob, can you put some of this information about your program in the chat right now?
I'll just tell you what it is. Alliance180.org. Alliance180.org. It's free to any veteran, police officer. Okay, I just can't do civilians as a nonprofit.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's a wonderful resource. I do want to point out, no, it's good. It's really wonderful. I do want to point out that this training was just an introduction to MST. Samantha is coming from an attorney background. The training was targeted for peers, so veterans that are helping other veterans. Here in Suffolk County, we have a team of Dwyer peers. I've had, a lot of peers come up to me and mention, as men, they don't know how to hold space for women that disclose MST. Some people come up to me and say they don't know what resources are out there. So we were very excited to have Samantha come in and fill in those gaps. But to Bob's point, alternative therapies that help people re-regulate their emotions are so critical. Equine therapy is amazing. There's art therapy. Some veterans talking doesn't help at all. They need to hit the gym. They need to be kinesthetic. And for all you clinicians that are working with people that do find talk therapy helpful, like you're doing wonderful work as well. It's all augmentative and it's all collaborative. So, you know, not everything's going to fit for every vet. So I'm so grateful for all of you guys coming here, because you being here and, you know, sharing space with Samantha, you're doing the work of helping this community.
Can I
Whether
ask
you're
one
an
other
ally or a
question?
vet. Yeah.
Is there anything that it addresses or how to approach men? Because sexual assault is not just for women, as we know. MST is not just for women. And men are not as open to talk about it.
And
And
I think
I'm not as good at approaching men about it.
I think that, when I was talking about the fact that all survivors are going to be different and respond differently, that's, for example, something that I've seen in my practice. For example, I need my clients to tell me about what happened to them in the military for me to be able to help them legally in terms of any sort of fix for that. And so what I have found, for example, is many times when I say to my clients, you can come in and talk to me in person, or you can talk to me on the phone, or you could put together you can write something down for me to read that tells me what happened to you. I don't care the medium we use, as long as I'm starting to get that understanding of what happened. And what I found, for example, is women clients often want to come in and talk to me in person. They want to make that eye contact. They want to have that conversation face to face. A lot of times male clients do not. A lot of times they will be like, can I put together a statement like on a piece of paper, send it to you in the mail, and we can go from there. If you have follow-up questions, I'm happy to talk about it, but I don't want to have like a long drawn out conversation. Obviously, neither of those examples are all inclusive of the genders. There's a million different experiences, but being flexible in how you have those approaches and have those conversations is important, because every survivor is different. Some survivors are very comfortable talking about what happened. Some survivors are very much not. Some can't remember a lot of key details. You got to meet the survivor where they are and not force people to work within one uniform model, because that's when you lose people. When you are expecting everyone to respond to the exact same setup, that's when you're going to have folks who drop off and say, this isn't for me. Right.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Catherine, do you want to drop your email in the chat? I know we probably already have it, but I will get you a large list of veteran discharge and disability upgrade resources. Like there's you in your county, I don't know if you're Suffolk County, but whatever county you're in, you have Samantha, you have the state, you have your VSA, your Veteran Service Agency, and you have your,
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, I will do that right now.
Okay.
Get back, figure it back out again.
Yeah.
Oops, no, don't do that one. Okay, there we go.
Okay, last call for questions. Okay, thank you. So, Erin, did you have a question earlier? I saw you.
No, I'm fine. I actually just want to say thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm dealing a lot in higher ed with military cultural competency for faculty and staff. The federal grant for veterans through the Department of Ed. We were just awarded a $600,000 federal grant. And one of the elements that Ed wanted to see in the grant was trauma-informed care. So I'm going to be incorporating being trauma-informed for faculty staff in conjunction with the military cultural competency element.
That's wonderful. They really go hand in hand, and
Exactly.
it's such a need, especially if you are working in an agency or a location where you have folks who served, folks who didn't. Maybe you have no one who served and you're only serving people who did serve. There's a huge military civilian divide in the country, and there's not a lot of understanding from folks who didn't serve of the experiences of those who did. And so, I mean, I think everyone should get military cultural competency, because it's shocking how little most civilians know. And I think that being trauma informed is part of that. If you're going to be working with this population, you got to know trauma. You got to have a sense of how to approach it, whether it's MSC, combat,
Right.
just military life and the transition back home, all of it.
Absolutely. So thank the two of you so much. Yeah.
We'll make sure you guys get those slides.
Yeah.
And
Thank
we
you.
are really grateful, Erin and Pamela, you guys showing up. Erin is at St. Joe's, Pamela is at Stony Brook, and they take care of all of our student veterans at those locations, and we're really grateful that they showed up. But thank you guys so much. You've made this such an amazing experience.
Thank
We'll
you
definitely
so very much.
We'll definitely have Samantha back. And if you have any questions, Nancy will be sending out those slides shortly, and feel free to reach out. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day, everyone.
Keep us on your list.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Keep us on your list. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.